Gabe, it is my favorite week of the quarter, and I think you might agree with me on that. That's because it is tech earnings week. We have all these tech companies reporting earnings this week. And one of the ones I always like to highlight, I think we talk about this every quarter on the podcast, but I like going back to Apple because I don't know how many years ago they started doing this, but they started breaking out their services revenue about 10 years ago now. And since then, we've seen this $4.8 billion business division grow into what is, as of now, $100 billion of revenue for Apple.
It's just an insane number, isn't it? And just insane growth. And it aligns so perfectly to the topic of what we want to talk about today, Zach, which is how to shift your business, how to grow new revenue streams while at the same time maintaining the core business and the quality business that you have.
Absolutely. And the last thing I'll say about Apple, and I haven't broken it down yet, I haven't had time to get into Excel, but historically that services revenue has been more than their Mac, Apple Watch, wearables, so on, all these iPad included, Mac included, business divisions combined. So it is such a big revenue generator for Apple, right behind the iPhone. But
yeah, I was going to say it's basically iPhone, services, and then kind of everything else, right?
Exactly. Everything else combined, mind you. So I just like to call out how Apple has built that platform. And there's a great quote from Tim Cook from about 10 years ago on this too, basically telling investors, like, watch what happens here. And now their services business it's basically its own Fortune 500 company.
Yeah, it's wild. And I know you and I have talked about this before, but at an insanely high gross margin too. The margins are like 74%, I believe, or something like that, which is just nuts. And it aligns so perfectly to the kind of longer conversation we want to have today. But they started building this business at the time that they were being extremely successful with iPhone, and iPhone was having this explosive growth. And they said, all right, well, we've got this really successful business, but we know that in the future, we're going to need new revenue streams, and we're going to need new revenue from other places, right? So it's taking advantage of this, taking advantage of what you have in place to then build this great structure for future growth and future revenue.
I just assumed that future revenue would be the number of times I've had to replace my AirPods, but it's glad to have. I'm glad to have this services division as well.
Such a great point. I was actually I was working out this morning, and I have my Apple AirPod Pros in, and it reminded me of how much you hate them. And I have to say that is probably the worst Apple product. It's not a good product.
Which is funny because I just had this conversation this week with a friend. He was telling me how much he loves his AirPods, and I said, I've had to replace mine 4 times now, and I'm not like careless. They just, I don't know what happened, but I'm hoping now that I've got the new ones that maybe they've remedied their previous problems. But enough about AirPods. I do think they're a good product, but it's still the worst Apple product I've had to experience. But
I love them on the airplane. I do not love them for wearing headphones while I'm working out. They're not good for that.
I almost disagree with you on that, but enough about Apple, great right. Services business they have. But
yes,
let's talk a little bit about Meta. And Gabe, we talked a little bit about this week about how it seems like they're setting money on fire lately.
Yeah, so Meta's in an interesting spot. Meta being the parent company for Facebook and Instagram and all of the other wonderful products they build, buy, or steal. And one of the things that really jumped out to us, Zach, when we were looking at this for this week, is that they lost over $4 billion this quarter in their Reality Labs division, which is their kind of futures division, quote unquote. And you sent me this screenshot. I was cracking up when you sent it to me because I literally had just screenshotted it and was about to send it back to you from the article that you sent. But in total, they have lost $58 billion since 2020 on these future projects, which is just a staggering amount of money.
If I lost $58 billion, I feel like I'd be very concerned, but here I am. Gabe, it's
well, they also make tons of money in the rest of their business, so they can afford
they can
to
kind of
lose
offset that. Yeah,
exactly. Which is again what we want to talk about today, right? They're making so much money from the rest of their business that they can kind of have these future bets. And it's really interesting because what they're doing is that this is really this is where Oculus rolls up. This is where those fancy Ray-Ban glasses roll up. This is their, they're trying to build out what they really see is the future beyond the smartphone. So the smartphone has, I think we can all agree, been one of the, certainly the most adopted pieces of technology in our lifetimes. And at some point, though, that will shift, right? That will change. And what Meta is betting on is that wearable technology, and specifically technology that you put on your face and use to interact with the world, is going to be the way that most of us interact with technology. I don't know how I feel about that, Zach, but that's their bet.
It's interesting, not to go back to Apple, but I remember like when the Apple Watch came out, one of the big things Apple was talking about was, having a wearable product. It's a very personal product, for in numerous reasons. So I see, things like what do they call it, like Meta Ray-Bans, or what is the glasses they
I know
have
their
for that?
partnership with Ray-Ban. I forget what the exact name is. It'll come to me at some point, but it is
Either way,
the technology that's built into the Ray-Bans, which continue to get smaller and smaller and look more and more like regular glasses.
yeah, and that's what I was kind of getting to here is, in the past I think of like the Google Glass or like the giant, heads that you have to wear, like a very
Mm-hmm.
obvious camera and things like that sticking out. But when they make these personal devices, I mean, they're getting the technology's getting there. I don't know. I'd like to try it out for a day and see, if it's something I'd be interested in. But me, I'm always a early adopter on new technology, and to have this goal to ultimately replace the smartphone, that's a big bet.
That's a lofty goal because obviously the smartphone market is massive. And the other part that's interesting is that Meta doesn't really, I mean, I guess obviously we use the applications from Meta on our smartphones, but outside of that, they're not actually getting any benefit from the hardware technology or the other services that they could be potentially selling over the top of it, like Apple is. So it's what I would call an asymmetrical bet, right? So obviously they've lost an obscene amount of money, building this, but the market is so big that if they're right, they're going to be incredibly wildly successful because they're going to be so far ahead of everybody else. So it's a very asymmetrical bet where yes, it's a big investment, but the upside is massive. And like, I know we kind of want to talk about this around Google as well, Zach, but that's really I think that's the frame of reference that I always think about when I think about the Meta piece as they're building this futures division.
Exactly, and think how far ahead they already are on some of these items or these products. I think of the virtual reality headsets. Meta's had their headsets out for years now. I remember the first time I tried one, and I gotta sit down. This is making me dizzy now, and now I own one, and you have a player like, again, Apple, who comes in with a new product, and as much as I love Apple products, the reality is Meta is already so far ahead in this area. They've invested that they've changed their business with this model and this in mind. But yeah, I'm excited to see where this goes, especially for a company like
Same.
Meta.
Yeah, same. It's going to be really interesting to see what does this look like in 10 years? And do these investments that they're making now, while they look kind of silly at this point, are they going to look very, very smart in a relatively short period of time?
I'm sure the
10,
iPhone looks
10
silly.
years,
I mean, I remember reading comments
100%.
about like, oh, it doesn't have a keyboard, kind of thing. And now I can't imagine. I mean, I've never had an iPhone with a keyboard, I guess, but like, I can't imagine having a phone with a keyboard. But
I made the transition from BlackBerry to iPhone, and I will tell you, the lack of keyboard was one of the things. Like, oh, I don't know that I'm going to like this, but once I started using the iPhone, it was over. You mentioned Apple Watch too. That's another great thing, and I think Apple Watch is probably my favorite Apple product.
I agree. I've always said the Ultra 2 Apple Watch is my favorite Apple product. My second favorite is my personal laptop is an Apple Silicon M1 Pro. So any Apple M1 chip is my favorite Apple product.
Fair enough. All right. Well, I want to talk about Google here for a minute too, because they were also out with earnings this week. And one of the things that Google does is they have their moonshot or their other bets division. So very similar to Meta, where they have this Reality Labs that kind of sits underneath the Meta proper, right? But it's their, hey, we don't really know if this is going to work, but we're just going to try some crap and see what happens. And I think it's really interesting to look at this in comparison for Google to Meta. So Google also has incurred massive operating losses for this division. Over the last 5 years, it's estimated that they've lost about $20 billion. However, it's also resulted in some really interesting businesses for them, business models for them that are either making money for them now or are going to potentially make a ton of money for them in the future. One of the first ones that I stumbled across, Zach, when I was doing some research around this was Waymo, which is the self-driving cars, which I know you want to talk about. So I think feel like we got to
Absolutely.
get into this one on the Waymo side, because it's a massive potential market, potentially a $2 trillion addressable market over the next 10 years. And again, where Meta is in the lead from a kind of wearable technology perspective, I feel like Waymo's definitely in the lead when it comes to self-driving automation.
It's funny, Gabe. A couple weeks ago on the way home from Connections, on the way to the airport, I was in an SUV, but next to me rolls up this self driving, and it's got the lidar and everything on top,
Yep.
and a part of me was jealous. I was like, man, I wish I could be in that car, right? But I'm just fascinated by self driving technology. Waymo, I have you ever ridden in a Waymo, Gabe?
I have not. I've seen a few of them. I was in Phoenix, Scottsdale, and they're pretty pervasive there. That was just a few months ago, and I saw a lot of them on the road. I was actually standing in front of a restaurant waiting for an Uber to come pick me up, and a Waymo pulled up. A bunch of people got in the back, and the car just left. My favorite Waymo slash self driving car story, Zach, though, was this is a couple of months ago. I was driving home from the airport. It was late at night, and driving through San Francisco, and later in the evening is when they do a lot of the tests for the self-driving cars, just to make sure there's not as much traffic on the road when they're doing a lot of these tests. So this self-driving car is driving along, and it's getting ready to make a right turn. And there's a person behind this car who feels like they should be making the turn more rapidly. And so this person is just laying on the horn, honking at a driverless car. And I just thought that was so funny that this person is just literally screaming into the void and honking at a driverless car. It made me laugh so hard. And it just cracks me up every time I think about it.
Well, it's funny because we can't talk self-driving cars without talking about Tesla, because this is, I would argue this is one of the big selling points of their vehicles. And again, we've talked about this in the past. I've always said, like, I like the technology behind Tesla, but I ask you if you've been in a Waymo, and I'm going to ask you again now on the Tesla side. Have you tested the full self-driving, or how confident would you be, either Tesla or Waymo even, with that full self-driving?
So I have not yet. They're doing a free trial right now. And I honestly just haven't been driving very much over the last couple of weeks. I've been home. I haven't had to go to the airport or anything, but I'm going to the airport on Monday. And I think I'm going to give it a go, dude, and actually like try the FSD thing on the way to the airport.
It's funny because yeah, you know me, I was talking to my parents about buying a Model Y, and just validating my opinions here. But one of the things my mom mentioned, she's like, oh, I would never want to stop and charge for 10 minutes or 20 minutes, and I'm like, the reality is you're doing that. You're stopping at a gas station, or you don't have
Correct.
the full tank of gas, as they say, when you leave your house. But I part of me came back to the self driving thing, and I'm like, knowing the time I've spent behind a self driving Tesla now, like, the convenience itself is worth a 10-20 minute stop, in my opinion. So, Gabe, I hope you do have the ability
I'll
to
let you
test that
know.
out.
I'll let you know how it goes. I'll see if I have the fortitude to do it this week, this coming week, and I'll let you know
Yeah.
how it goes.
But Waymo aside, couple other businesses here,
Yeah.
Gabe. Nest.
Yeah, so Nest, this is one that they kind of acquired and then put into this moonshot division for a little while. But this is another area where smart home technology. It started as the Nest thermostat and then has grown really aggressively from there. Not just thermostats, but Wi-Fi systems and cameras and all
Connected
kinds of
home.
different things. Yeah, connected home, right? And this has been a very successful division for them coming out of there also. And then the last one is Google Fiber. This is a broadband service provider that's launched in multiple markets around the country. I would say this has been very successful for Google, not only from a just getting customers signed up, but it's also really pushed the industry forward. I always had this thought in my mind that Google didn't really care if they made a lot of money in building a fiber provider. They wanted to just incent other companies to build fiber faster, to get faster speeds to customers. And the reason for that is makes a better experience for people who are using other Google products. If you're using YouTube, if you're using any of the other myriad of Google products, if you have faster internet, that's a better experience for you. And I don't think there's any doubt that what Google did with pushing Google Fiber out in kind of forced people's hands of delivering faster speeds. And then they're delivering a really high quality experience to a bunch of people across the US as well. So I'd say all of those are, areas where they were able to take ideas, these moonshot ideas or other bets, and make them into successful, or, with something like Waymo, what will likely be a very successful business model in the future.
I agree, Gabe. And there's one last comment here on the future of autonomous driving too. But it sounds like in the next 10 years, we're looking at a $2 trillion addressable market.
It's huge. It's similar to what we talked about with Meta, right? Where it's an asymmetrical bet. You're spending a ton of money, potentially losing a ton of money at the beginning of this process. And thankfully, companies like Google and Meta can afford to lose this tons of money because they're so successful in other areas. But they're making this asymmetrical bet of, okay, if this works out and we're able to make a business out of this, the addressable market of this is so massive. In the case of Waymo, driving, which all of us do, pretty much every day, right? Moving that to driverless. And then in the case of Meta, smartphones to some other technology that we may all be using at some point in the future. And we can't remember a world where we didn't have, Meta smart glasses, right? Like we do right now with our smartphones.
Well, it's funny because again, a couple weeks ago, Tesla had their they had an event. They called it We Robot, I think it was, and they talked about this robo taxi and this autonomous bus. And they showed these two products. That the taxi didn't have a steering wheel and things
Mm-hmm.
like that. But
Love the look of that car too. It looks so cool.
it goes back to is this something that people are going to buy? Like, would you buy a car without a steering wheel? Like, I don't know if I would, knowing my driving habits, but the thought of this, or like, having access to this, it would be a cool second car for me. Like if you're just doing a road trip or buzzing around town, not having to worry about driving, it could be interesting whether it's Waymo or Tesla.
Yep.
I'm excited to see what that market looks like.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see how all this goes. But, these companies are, again, they're making these investments. They're setting themselves up for the future by doing the things that they need to do now in order to be successful, with these business models in the future. They're not going to be starting from scratch when all of a sudden self-driving becomes a thing and they're like, oh crap, well now we have to catch up. No. These companies are way ahead. And
we've seen companies in that position of, oh, well, now we have to catch up. So, we've seen a little bit of that today, but again, these companies have built a platform basically that they can continue to build on top of. They've invested heavily in these areas of their businesses.
Yep. Yeah, that's a good word, platform, Zach. I think that's a really good word for it. They built this successful platform and they've done this. So the original kind of topic of the podcast today, Zach, was around this book, Lead and Disrupt, which is the kind of follow-up to Innovator's Dilemma. And the idea behind the book is that successful companies navigate the balance between innovation and disruption. And they do that by being ambidextrous. And when I say that, what I really mean is, and this is another term that's talked about a lot in the book, but it's the idea of exploitation versus exploration. And I think those examples that we just talked through with Meta and Google are really good examples of businesses that, it sounds like kind of a mean word, but I do like the exploitation versus exploration part of this. They're exploiting their existing base of businesses to explore what future businesses could look like and how they're going to be successful in the future.
I'm all about it. I'm a curious enough person that I need to get my hands on this book, Gabe. I know you're a little ahead of me there, but I'm curious enough that I feel like I fit right into what these companies are doing.
Well, and I think you understand the overall concept here, Zach, with just the conversation we were just having around these companies, and the other part of it that I thought was really interesting is they talk a lot about success syndrome in the book, and that when things are going really well, leaders don't want to mess those things up. And I think you and I talked about this a bit recently as it relates to the broadband service provider space. There's been a lot of success with broadband service providers over the last few years, specifically coming out of COVID. COVID was really good for the BSP business. Everybody realized that the internet was very important. All of a sudden, all of us were in our homes. We were working from home. We were learning from home. We were doing all of these things. And what was maybe a nice to have for some people previously, all of a sudden became an absolute requirement. So this whole idea of, hey, my business is being really successful and I don't want to mess this up. sometimes prevents us from looking at, well, what are the things that I need to explore? How
What's
do I need
next?
to exactly what's next, right? What are the things that are next to, to tweak? And Zach, you and I were talking about a company that frankly we're not sure if they're going to be able to do this. And we talked about successful companies who are kind of navigating this with Meta and Google, but we were talking about Snapchat. And I'd be curious to hear your perspective on this because you're much more of a Snapchat user than I am. But it feels like they have one business, one product, one revenue stream, ads, and it doesn't seem like they've been able to really create anything new or inventive that would help them drive their business forward at some point in the future.
They haven't. So they're operating off this. I don't want to say limited revenue, but their revenue stream has been exactly what you just described. And I remember 10 years ago, I remember like being at some event in high school, and everyone was like, "Oh, do you have Snapchat?" Or like this new app called Snapchat. We all downloaded it, and since then, it's relatively the same app. Now they've done some new things with the app, and Snap Maps or like the stories and the reels and things like that. But the reality is, it's the same product that hasn't adapted. And while that hasn't adapted, we've seen companies like Meta come in with Instagram and build Snapchat features right into their app. And the problem we run into there, or the problem Snapchat runs into, I should say, is Meta has the funding to do this. We just talked about them spending 58 billion on this business division here. Snapchat can't do that. They don't have that kind of revenue to.
They're not even a profitable business.
Exactly. Do you remember they used to make glasses? I think it was,
Yes.
and I think at one
Mm-hmm.
point they attempted to make like a little drone kind of thing, but they have not been an impressive business. It's been an app that people use, and I would be curious to know what the usage numbers are today compared to maybe its peak or 5-10 years ago kind of thing. But it's one of those companies that you look at what's next, and they don't pay me to answer that question, but I'd be very curious to know from the Snapchat point of view, what is next? What is the next thing they're going to do? Again, we've seen what Meta is doing with Instagram, Facebook. Um, App called BeReal came out a while back, which exploded in popularity. So
Mm-hmm.
they all have these different business models, features, functionality, but Snap has been relatively consistent. And again, I'm curious to know what's next. I know they launched a
Consistent and maybe not such a great way, right?
exactly.
It's
They've
basically
tried to
just been the same.
yeah, they've tried to monetize their platform, and I don't think they've done a good job. They have Snapchat Plus now, which gives what I would call comical features that I can't imagine many people pay for. Not to hate on Snapchat so much, but again, going back to what's next, that's a question that they need to have an answer to if they want to succeed.
Yeah. And so much of this comes down to leadership of the organization and that leadership being able to be, again, ambidextrous, right? And be able to kind of, I was thinking about the title for this episode, Zach, and I think about walking and chewing gum at the same time. It's being able to do multiple things at the same time and still drive your business forward by, again, being able to exploit the current business that you have and build that culture of innovation and exploration to be able to think about what is next. Even if I have to make some bets, like there are smart bets and asymmetric bets around specific markets that could be potentially massive and completely change the game for a company like Meta, where they may shift more into hardware versus services of what they're doing right now. And again, because they have this massive, in the case of Meta, they have this massive, call it, user base, right? For lack of a better term, of daily active users on Instagram, on Facebook proper, on WhatsApp, on all of these things. They have this huge group of people that they can exploit to sell new products to when those things do become valuable and become more broadly adopted in the market.
I agree. Just to sum up the whole Meta Snapchat conversation, I'm excited to see what's next.
Yeah.
Again, with on the Meta side, that $58 $58 billion investment. Um, I've always been impressed by their wearables, their headsets and whatnot. So Gabe, we might have to go out and buy some sunglasses.
They're not that expensive, actually. I feel like, man, that's the other piece when you were talking about that, Zach, around the advances that they've made. They've made the cost so much more approachable for people. That's obviously been the huge negative feedback for the Apple product is like, oh my gosh, this thing is astronomically expensive.
$3,500 compared to
Exactly.
what is it, $400, $500 for Meta? They've got some
Yeah,
different models.
absolutely. They've got a couple of different models, but yeah, I mean, I think they have. I think they have some that are even maybe like 250 now. Like they're very approachable from a cost perspective. Certainly, much more so than the Apple products.
Which, mind
So
you, is apparently, rumor has it, they're winding production down on that. And that's
yeah,
very interesting to hear. Now, there could be multiple reasons. They could be coming out with a new product or, something, what's next for Apple. They're always thinking ahead. But
hmm
like I said in the beginning of this podcast, it Meta's the established player in this space. And Apple coming out with a $3,500 headset, in my opinion, was a little bit of a mistake there.
hmm
Now I don't own one, so I can't really speak to what it's like to use one on the daily, but um, I think there are some great use cases there. But think of your consumers, think of your price point. A $300 headset versus a $3,500 headset is, you know, big difference.
huge difference. Yeah, absolutely. So I wanted to kind of wrap this up with a couple of things, Zach. I wanted to talk just very briefly about organizational structure and kind of what this means. And I don't want to get into too much detail here because I get out of my depth and I think it would be good for people to just go read the book. But I also wanted to talk briefly about kind of what this means for the broadband service provider space and how people can start to think about this in their own business. So just to talk about the organizational design structure really quick. Again, that word ambidextrous comes up so frequently in the book, and just thinking about how you design the structure of your leadership team, the structure of your organization. There are some specific things that are talked about in the book around how you allocate resources strategically, how you maintain structural independence by keeping the units that are focused on exploitation and exploration separate, so you're not avoiding conflicts, but also making sure that everything is tied to the overall strategic goals of the organization. So these things are really important. Again, I would say if this is a topic that you want to dig into more deeply and really understand how companies have done this successfully and unsuccessfully, I would highly recommend the book and kind of digging in there around these specific topics and getting a better understanding of how to do this. But anything that jumps out to you there, Zach, around how people should be structuring their organizations or fostering this idea of exploitation versus exploration?
No, I think it's a great point, making sure that they receive the adequate resources. I keep going back to this Meta example, but if you're just an average Facebook user or Instagram user, you may not have any idea that this huge investment is going on in the background. It doesn't impact the core product or the core customer experience.
That's a really good point. And you mentioned something else there, which is allocating resources. And that's something that's discussed a lot in the book as well, is budgets. And I know it's not necessarily the most exciting topic, but the reality is that businesses run on budgets. You're allocated a certain number of resources that you're allowed to spend on hiring, to spend on other investments that you need to make in the business. Well, where a lot of businesses have failed in this idea of being ambidextrous is they don't allocate enough budget to the exploration activities. And oftentimes, where companies have failed, they've put the budget under the exploitation area. Whereas, again, a company like Meta, not to continue to hammer on this example, but they've got a whole separate budget that's allocated to, setting money on fire, right? And that's okay for them because they've set their organization up to be able to handle that. So that's a really important part of this, is making sure that you're allocating resources, in this case financial resources, appropriately based on how you want to grow your business as you move forward.
I love that phrase, Gabe, setting money on fire. I try to refer to it as an investment, but I just love that phrase.
Well, I mean, some of it may be setting money on fire, right? We don't know. I mean, this could end up being a really bad bet, and they could end up
Mm-hmm.
losing a lot of money on it. Much like Apple did with the Apple VR headset, right? I mean, that may end up being a not successful investment. But if you've set your business and the structure up in a way that allows you to make these bets, you're successful enough in other areas of your business that even if not all of them work out, it's still going to be okay. It's going to be okay, right?
Mhm.
Like we know not all of these are going to be a home run. That's just the reality of innovation. But if you're if you're right, even probably 55% of the time, you're going to be really successful as a business.
The home run example, Gabe. No one plays baseball knowing they're going to step up to the plate and hit a home run, every time. So, um,
Except for my son, who was wildly disappointed the first time that he did not hit a home run when he went up to bat. He also was really disappointed the first time I took him golfing and he did not hit a hole in one. So
oh
um,
well,
kids
I
got
have
high
done neither of
expectations.
those things. I'm still
Same.
working on the hole in one, but someday. I think that's my dad recently. He got like very close, and I thought like, oh man, like the feeling to hit the hole in one or just knock it out of the park here, especially as it relates to business.
Oh
Oh,
yeah, nothing better. I've never hit a hole in one either, but I'm not a very good golfer, so that
oh,
makes
I
sense.
am not competitive in golf.
Yeah.
If you see me golfing, just know it's purely for fun. I'm probably not even keeping score.
Well, let's wrap this up with the broadband service provider kind of thoughts here, Zach. And as I thought about the book, as I thought about this idea of being ambidextrous and exploitation versus exploration, to me it really comes down to what new services would a broadband service provider bring to market that would help them grow revenue and help them move out of potentially an existing area of their business. And this is one area where I feel like there's a lot of similarities between a broadband service provider and a company like Meta. And I know that may seem like a weird thing to say, but there's typically you've got this base of subscribers that a lot of information about, or you can know a lot of information about. And because of that, you can be really thoughtful about what types of services you can bring to market. So I'll just kind of throw that out there. But like, what are your thoughts around, kind of how BSPs would manage this process, and what types of services do you think about, as they're making these transitions?
Gabe, it goes back to what we talked about it earlier, was building that platform, and for the most part,
Mm,
I feel like for every case, our BSPs that we work with have done this. They've got the fiber in the ground, and now
yes.
it's to the point with Snapchat. Well, what's next? What do we do next? The infrastructure there. How do we, like Apple, monetize this platform we've built? So, I think of my BSP even, and what managed services they provide. One of the favorites is 1Password, which is something I subscribe to anyway, but password manager app. But it's it comes down to the individual person and your market. What are people interested in?
Hmm.
I always see on Facebook the package thieves, right? It's like, oh, someone stole this package. Someone stole this package. Everyone on Facebook trying to track these people down. I'm like, man, wouldn't it be nice if everyone had like a video doorbell or something like that? But I feel like it just goes back to addressing the needs in your community. What problems can we solve? Or think of the Waymo, the Tesla, these different Google ventures as well. But is there something we can invest in and potentially see an ROI, or potentially see some of this come back?
Yep. Yeah, and that's the bit, right? Is it's making the investments to see that future growth. And again, not all of them are going to work out, right? We're not going to hit hole in ones every time, or home runs every time. So it's setting up your business and structure in a way that you can do that exploration to determine, is this something that's going to be, is this going to be a way for me to grow my revenue base, right? And whether it's growing my ARPU for my existing customers, whether it's maybe growing into a completely new revenue stream. But I think there's a lot of opportunity here for broadband service providers specifically to, again, lean into, I think you hit it there, Zach, too, listening to the community. What are the services that people are asking for? Frankly, just going out and asking the community, whether that be through surveys or whatever, right? But just gathering some data around how people are engaging in your community, what are the things that they're interested in, and then making sure that you're aligning those services around that, and placing those calculated bets to make sure that you're setting your business up for continued success in the future, not just exploiting the business that you have, but exploring what that business could look like in the future.
Understanding your data, understanding your customers, and appealing to them.
Yep, absolutely. It seems
Well,
simple, right? It seems so simple, but
yeah, it's so simple. Let's go out and do
yeah.
it. Well, Gabe, I know you've got a flight to catch here on Monday, so I'm hoping I hear back on this, supervised full self driving functionality here. And
Wait, I can't just nap all the way to the airport. I thought that was what it was. What I could do with self driving.
I've seen videos on YouTube, and I'm like, it's.
Terrifying.
I don't want to like advocate for that at all, but
No.
it's interesting to me that people have that trust in the technology. So I'm very excited to see where this goes, because I can't imagine, Gabe, growing up, you thought you'd be driving or sitting in a self-driving car at the airport someday, but we might
I
be
think
there
about
Monday.
this. I think about this often with my kids and wonder if they will even learn how to drive, or if by the time they get to driving age, are they just going to be driven around by a car?
Okay, well, Gabe, in a few years, this is what I want you to do here as we wrap up the podcast. When your kids do take driver's ed and they have to take that driver's test, let them use the Tesla on full self driving and see if that counts. I'm curious to know
Funny.
if that's a passing test or not.
I love it. That's awesome. I'm gonna have to do that.
Awesome. Well, Gabe, thank you for joining us and tuning into Buffering. And if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to follow us on your favorite podcast app and to share it with your friends and colleagues. And for more insights and updates, be sure to connect with Gabe and I on LinkedIn.